Welcome into the I-80 Club +1. Josh Peterson, Jack Mitchell with you as always. And tonight's special guest from the Kings of the North podcast. It is Doug Lesmerises joining us for the very first time inside of the I-80 Club. Doug, thank you so much. How's your Tuesday treating you?
Doing very well. I appreciate you guys reaching out and having me on the show. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. Absolutely. We are super pumped to have you on. We were talking right before we got rolling about just your guys' pod in general, you and Bill Landis. You guys do quite a few pods a week, which I know that Jack and I and our audience really, really enjoy. I told my wife recently, Doug, that it was the college football podcast that I didn't think I needed, but I have found that I have wanted as I've really gotten into it this season. The idea behind this, like we figured we could start with a little KOTN stuff. What was it that led you to leaving legacy media behind and to starting this project?
Wow, that is a great question. Okay, so I started covering Ohio State football in 2005 for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. The first game I ever covered there was Vince Young beating Ohio State in Ohio Stadium the year that Texas won the national title in 2005. So I worked there for 17 or 18 years covering Ohio State. And there was this phrase, right? So we don't want to get sued, but we have swords and crowns, we know. So on the show that shall not be named, they call it like the king in the North, right? So but we talked about kings of the North, and it originally, it's the in and the of. They can't sue us for that.
Right.
So, and where's my crown? My crown's here. Oh yeah. So I don't wear it every day because I don't want to get sued, but it's here.
It's like McDowell's and McDonald's in Coming to America, right? You know, it's like the same thing, right? Yeah.
So just I also think sometimes when I wear the crown, then these look like earrings. So sometimes it's not my best look. So anyway, I used the phrase. So what really happened was when the South was dominating college football, and the SEC in particular, and it really came out of Ohio State, that Ohio State was at that time, before Michigan had its run of 3 straight Big Ten titles, 3 straight playoff appearances, 3 straight wins over Ohio State. Ohio State was the best team in the North and then would go lose. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, frustrated a lot of Ohio State fans. And I just felt like it was a Southern dominated conversation around college football. And so I think I remember using the phrase in 2019 when Ohio State was playing Clemson in a college football playoff semifinal. I was asking people about this idea. And I remember asking Urban Meyer about it when Urban Meyer's doing TV, and he had, it was the year after he left Ohio State. And I said that they're the king of the North. And he sort of said it back to me in the answer. It was this is a thing. So it started off more really as an excuse, as an admission that the South is better at this. They're winning all the national titles, but can't we talk about Northern college football and the culture and the community and all the good things about it, rather than focusing on the idea that the SEC keeps winning on all the titles, or that Clemson's winning the titles, right? That I wanted to have a separate conversation, acknowledging that the South was better. And then the North rose up. The North rose up. And we started this show last year, and Washington and Michigan played for the national title. And we went to 5 days a week this year, and there are 10 undefeated teams in FBS, and 8 are in the North, and the SEC is on fire, and Iowa State and Pitt and Indiana and all these teams you never thought we do 28 Northern Power Conference teams that we focus on. 16 of 18 in the Big Ten, not USC and UCLA because they're in Southern California and they have too much sunshine. They can get bent. The top half of the Big 12, BYU, Utah, Iowa State, Colorado, Kansas State, Cincinnati, West Virginia, Notre Dame, and then the 3 Northern teams in the ACC, Syracuse, Pitt, Boston College. Those are the 28 teams we talk about. We basically cut the country in half, and there's so much good Northern football. We can't believe it. We can't believe what disarray the SEC is in. The greatest college football coach of all time retires. Kirby Smart is shoving people. It's a dream. It's manna from heaven. They're eating themselves in the South. And the North is great. There are so many great Northern teams to talk about, Nebraska among them. And so we lucked into it. But we just want to have, the main thing is, if I said Southern college football to you guys, to your audience,
yeah,
I think that conjures something. I don't think you have to, I don't think people would say, what does that mean? Southern college football. So I don't know, but if I said Northern college football, and I've had this happen when I'm trying to explain the show, if I say Northern college football, people say, what's that? And that's the point. We want it to be something because I believe that Washington fans have something in common with Nebraska fans, and Iowa State fans have something in common with Maryland fans, and that we should celebrate that culture and that community and putting on a hoodie and jumping in the leaves and going out to watch an October football game while they're melting in the South. We try to ask everybody we can about playing in the snow. Although we asked Pat Narduzzi, the pick coach, about that on the show, and he was like, climate change, man. I don't know if we have snow football anymore. And it's like, okay, well, remember when we had snow? So like that. So that's our definition. If I keep saying, if your coach owns a snow shovel, you're on Kings of the North.
That's great. First of all, I did not expect Narduzzi to be a climate change guy, to be honest.
I know. I was like, wow, we got deep here with Nardon.
I did not have that on my of any coach to be. You give me the entire slate of college football coaches. Narduzzi is about the last one I would have expected to bring up.
Like, okay,
climate change. Like, have you found that there's an audience for this? That like, did you know there was an audience for this? That there was kind of a group of fans of schools that had this same desire and burning in your heart that you did. Has it developed? What's that been like for you?
Not yet. We're shouting into microphones 5 days a week, and so there are people watching, there are people listening, right? Like it's like you check the Apple charts, and it's like, oh, we're number 81 or whatever. So like they're like
we get it, yeah.
But we're trying. So we try to celebrate, contextualize. We don't just blindly root for Northern teams, but we want to acknowledge when a 4-3 season's pretty good, right? We want to acknowledge when there's progress. We want to acknowledge good decisions. We want to acknowledge recruiting wins. We want to acknowledge that you love your team, even if they don't win every game. But we also want to hold them accountable. But we also tell the South to cram it, and people seem to like that.
Yes.
So when Bama is losing twice and when Tennessee is losing to Arkansas like that, oh my God. It was like, oh, we're going to seriously have Bama lose to Vanderbilt? I can't believe this is happening. So we do call out the national media narratives around Southern and SEC supremacy. And then, by the way, those narratives are on fire anyway. So again, like, I just want to say this, right? People love their teams. You love your team. So listen to your favorite podcast. Watch your favorite show about your team. And then if you are in the North and you are a college football fan, if you partake of another show beyond your team, try us. Because if you go to a national show, they're going to be doing a lot of Texas and Georgia and Alabama and LSU and Miami and Southern puffery. And we're just telling you, we're talking about the sport in an interesting, big picture way without that. So that's all we want to be. We want to be your second show beyond the one you love about your team.
Yeah, and Doug, along those lines, I mean, you mentioned it. Year one, you get blessed with this incredible culmination of a season, right, with Washington taking on Michigan. And then this year, it seems like this year is going to culminate in this expanded playoff with a lot of North versus South. And of course, the dream, how many of us have said for years, man, how fun would it be if, around here, it's Miami had to come to Lincoln, Nebraska. And everyone always uses Penn State for this. I want Penn State to host Alabama or Georgia. I wonder,
with
snow. And we want the snow. Like, I feel like of all the years for this podcast to start, you guys, you and Bill picked a really nice time because it does seem like the North is having a bit of a moment.
Yeah, and I think it's harder right now. Who's the third best team in the SEC? Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, wants to try to tell you the SEC should get 5. I'm not sure they should get 3 in the playoff as things stand right now. LSU is like being put forth as maybe the third or fourth best SEC team. That's the LSU who lost to USC, who has 4 Big Ten losses.
Yeah.
So, okay. But I do think, so it's about playing good football. But I am very much like, right, everyone's doing their playoff brackets along the way. I want as much north-south as possible. Like if Indiana and plays Oregon or Penn State or Ohio State in the playoff, like that would be fun. I would rather Indiana play LSU.
Yeah.
And I would rather Oregon play Tennessee. And I would rather Ohio State play Texas A&M. Like, give me as much of that as possible because, and I do think this, especially, and we got so lucky. Sorry to the Pac-12. But we planned to include Washington and Oregon in our show before the Pac-12 died. Yeah. Because we believed it really was much more of a north-south conversation than an east-west conversation anyway, right? Which I think this bore that out. It's like, oh, the Pac-12 died. It's like, well, that's not really what the sport's about. But I think there is a clear dividing line north-south. I hope the Big 12 sticks around as a conference. The ACC, I could go either way. But I really was preparing for the sport to divide almost wholly north-south. And we wanted to acknowledge that. And we also want to acknowledge that conferences are nuts. Geography doesn't matter anymore in conferences, but I think geography does matter in the sport. So we think like that's why we talk about Pitt. We talk about 3 ACC teams, but we don't care what happens to Clemson. Like they can do whatever they want to do. But we think Pitt's interesting. And we think Iowa State's interesting, but we don't care about what happens to Arizona. Because why does a conference have to tell us who we're supposed to care about? Let's talk about the schools that have something in common.
Doug, what's your theory on, kind of how the pro South football bias kind of started? It sounds when I hear you talk about it, it's mainly media related, I think, although you can correct me if I'm wrong, if there's more kind of tentacles to that whole thing. But why is it the way that it is? Why does your podcast need to exist?
Yeah, I do think it's multifaceted, but I do think the breaking point in a lot of ways was ESPN joining up with the SEC. Because in the last 20 years, the two most powerful entities in college football were ESPN and the SEC. But ESPN had been aligned with the Big Ten. So when you're getting that ESPN promotion, right? ESPN, but they're promoting, hey, we're going to have Ohio State, Penn State on in prime time, right? And so now that flipped, it was like, okay, now I think we really need to prepare to push back against that because I do think a lot of it was earned. And I've thought about I'm too old to write a book, but I was covering Ohio State in 2006 when Ohio State beats Michigan in a 1-2 game. And when that game ended, there were people who thought in a world where just two teams played for the national title, that should be a rematch for the national title because UNC had lost, and I don't know about Florida. And Urban Meyer, son of the North, Ohio native, beats Ohio State in the national championship game, and that's the rise. That's the beginning of the rise of the SEC. And then Nick Saban comes into Alabama the next year, and we're off and running. So they won on the field. And that's indisputable. What are you going to do? But that's in the past. But they did earn that to some degree. And then they built the narrative. They've always been better at promoting themselves than the Big Ten, for instance. The Big Ten loves to talk about libraries. The SEC talked about winning football games. And libraries are great, but when Tony Petitti gets up at Big Ten Media Days and wants to do 7 minutes on libraries first, it's like, I don't come to your library conference and talk about football. What are we doing here? Michigan and Washington are both in the Big Ten right now. Tony Petitti got up at Big Ten Media Days. I don't think he said that once. If Greg Sankey had 2 SEC teams that had played for the national championship, he wouldn't have stopped talking about it the entire offseason. So that's real. The Big Ten is good at making money. The Big Ten has been good and smart in realignment.
Yeah.
But they've been dumb about promoting themselves. And the SEC is like, come to the show, baby. Now, they also won. They had greater proximity to the greater number of good players. We all understand all that stuff that's happening. And the thing that, I will say it out loud, they cheated more.
Yeah.
Before NIL, they cheated more. So I was on a 40-minute screaming match on a different show today. And I was saying that the SEC cheated more. And the host said, well, they cheated better. It's like, is that what you call it down there? You cheated better? What are we doing here? So now where NIL is now legal. So I just think there were more Northern teams who were trying, not saying they didn't cheat, but I think they tried to pretend that rules existed. And the SEC was like, how much money can we leave in a McDonald's bag for you? So now that's over. And the transfer portal has opened up. So all the things that have happened have allowed the North to rise up because there is money in the North. They just couldn't use it before. They were reluctant to use it. But I think NIL has activated Northern spending. And I think that's going to lead to, I think it's even now. I'm not going to sit here and say the North is better, but I don't think the North has to take a back seat to the SEC at all anymore. And if your greatest argument in the South is, hey, we won 17 of the last 20 national championships, that's the past. Give me an argument that's now. Give him an argument that's today in the modern world of NIL portal, 12-team playoff. And by the way, the greatest college football coach ever just retired from Alabama. And guess what? It matters. The North's here, baby.
So I was going to ask you about that next, Doug, because we're still so in the early days of NIL. That was only 3 summers ago, right? When that thing,
Yep.
the switch was flipped up. The portal, we're a handful of years now, though I feel like it still is evolving. That said, It does seem like the sport is flattened. Last year's playoff and the results, I think, proved that. Even TCU making it the year before, I think, proved that. So do you think, like, how much of what is happening right now is like an odd blip? How much of it is something, it seems like you believe that we have entered into perhaps a new era of where the sport could go?
Absolutely new era.
Yeah.
Absolutely new. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think it will only continue to get better for the North as they figure this out. We are not very far removed. We're maybe 18 months removed from Ohio State having no idea how to manage NIL. And now Ohio State's got it figured out. And they got Caleb Downs in the portal. They got Quinshon Judkins in the portal. They got Will Howard in the portal, right? Like they got Seth McLaughlin in the portal. Things that really matter. You look at Derek Harmon for Oregon, I thought was the best player potentially in that Oregon-Ohio State game. He's a transfer from Michigan State. They made that happen. They got multiple transfers on their defensive line. Dylan Gabriel's a transfer. Will Howard's a transfer. I think it's 14 of 18 Big Ten teams this year are starting transfers. Credit to Nebraska for not being one of them. So I think like you can just see like we all this talk about Curt Cignetti, great coach. What also happened? They activated NIL at Indiana.
Yeah.
So they talk like you've got to do that. I think there's a lot of conversations happening now. There is enough money. I think there is. Is there more money in Minneapolis, Minnesota, or Greenville, South Carolina? There are big cities in the North. You don't think there's money in Lincoln, Nebraska? There's money there. You think in Mississippi? Old Miss has more money. They just were cheating better. So I think everybody up here, if they want to be serious about it, has an opportunity to do it. And then I think another thing with all the TV money that's come in, I think we have good coaches. There was a time. I'm always curious, right? You go realignment, TV deals. We're playing on Friday night. UCLA's playing at 9 a.m. in the morning on their body clock. All this crazy stuff. You lose tradition. You ask a lot of your fans, what are you gaining? Well, you're gaining money. Well, what's the money for?
Yeah.
I've asked that question so many times. What's the money for? And the money can't be for waterfalls in the locker room. But I do think Northern coaching has gotten better. From an era where Brett Bielema left Wisconsin for Arkansas, mostly because of money. I think you can look. Matt Rhule in Nebraska, how does that happen? Because you activate Nebraska has some money to spend. Getting Curt Cignetti has some money to spend. How does Jonathan Smith wind up at Michigan State from Oregon State? I think you can look at the level. Brett Bielema back at Illinois. There's some at Matt Campbell staying at Iowa State, not getting poached away by some crappy Southern team. How does this happen? I think a lot of those things have been activated. I think there's really good coaching in the North, and I think the talent is getting there, and here we are.
Doug, do you believe Southern football culture is a thing? And if so, what is it, and what's the Northern football culture's answer to it or difference from it, or how does it set itself apart?
So but like they're like it just means more, right? Even the Georgia AD,
right?
The Georgia AD who forgot how to talk or type when Kirby Smart shoved an opposing player. Silence. They throw a couple beer cans on the field. He writes like a 4,000-word essay, like he's Hemingway, and he ends it with "It just means more." Oh, it just means more. So I don't even know if we want to fight that. Right. So the whole thing is, right, everyone says there were more pro teams in the North. There weren't as many in the South. So the college football teams became like the pro teams. It became the things that people were connected to. I've been like, we're trying to come up. I think for us, it's like it just means the appropriate amount. Like it's
That's the worst logo ever. That's the worst slogan ever.
We're workshopping it, but it's like we love college football in the North, right? But maybe we won't poison trees because we love college football. Is that the dividing line? We love college football up here, but maybe we won't have a 2-year debate about how to penalize people because they put their fingers upside down. Right? Is horns down like the great debate of Southern football culture? So like stuff like that. So that's what but it doesn't mean you don't love it. It doesn't mean it's not important to you. It doesn't mean that you're any less passionate. But maybe we're a little less desperate. Maybe we're a little less nuts in a bad way, but we can still love our team. So again, like, I get it. It's just not going to fit. I don't think appropriate even fits across your chest on a t-shirt. So we'll get back to you when we figure out the right slogan.
Doug, one of our subscribers from Patreon, Corny, he asked, have you gotten any feedback from SEC fans on KOTN? He says it's good to have a different POV, but if I shared that with some of my friends here, because he lives in Atlanta, they would akin it to the SEC shorts for the Big Ten. What is the feedback from the Southern audience for the pod?
Yeah, they get triggered, I think. I mean, like, I don't
surprised.
They're offended by anything that doesn't bow down at the altar. So there is one, I mean, and we'll take anybody. If you want to hate watch us, great.
Yeah, welcome.
We agree.
Welcome.
Yeah.
I hate that guy. I watch him every day.
Give us a thumb.
Boom. We'll take it.
Like and subscribe.
I have a hateable face. I get it. I know what we're doing here. But I believe everything I say. I'm not saying, like, this is not a bit. Like, I really do think the North has been underrated, right? So we do have a little bit of that. I mean, if you're that kind of person, if you just want college football talk about, like for instance, we did a little bit on the weekend that was Texas, Georgia, and Alabama, Tennessee. We had a Southern guest on and talked about them for half an hour in the midst of like a 7-hour week. But we talked about it much less than anybody else who's doing a pseudo national show, right? But we also talked more about Indiana, Nebraska. Yeah. Right. And so like sometimes even like when Southern shows like say, like try to analyze Indiana, Nebraska, I'm like, get our names out of your mouth. Indiana, Nebraska, that's us. Do you know how hard we hit Rutgers, Nebraska? Oh my God. Like we were like, you must watch Rutgers, Nebraska. We were berating people why you've got to watch that game.
That was bad advice. That was bad advice.
I was like Ethan Kaliak Manis, Dylan Raiola. Doesn't get any better than this. But also, by the way, you know who sucked? Carson Beck and Nico Iamaleava and Jalen Milroe and Quinn Ewers, who got benched. The 4 SEC. I'm not sure Arch Manning as a backup isn't the best quarterback in the SEC. And you can cram it with Garrett Nussmeier, by the way. I've had enough of Garrett Nussmeier, future NFL star. Please. First it was Jackson Dart. Now they're grasping, right? Diego Pavia is the greatest thing to ever happen. That's why Vanderbilt was tied with Ball State entering the fourth quarter last week. So there is some reaction, but like also like we're not for them.
Yeah,
they have plenty. How many shows do you know? So we've said shorthand, like we want to be the fine bomb of the North, but we have on guys from a show called Saturday Down South. They have a whole SEC and the Big Ten Network. The Big Ten Network won't fight. The Big Ten Network is corporate. The Big Ten Network is, boy, we sure had a great game today up here in Big Ten country. It's like someone's got to fight. Someone's got to fight for the North. So we'll fight for the North because there are plenty of shows for everybody in the South.
Any Northern fan base has been particularly receptive? What you've probably gotten to know some of them after, obviously you covered Ohio State for a long time, but any of them surprise you with their reaction to the pod or any of the things you're talking about from the North?
I mean, we'll be honest, right? Like it is a largely Ohio State audience, I think, still, because Bill Landis and I both came out of covering Ohio State. But I also think it's fair to think of Columbus, Ohio as the capital of Northern football. Just if you thought of Tuscaloosa, Alabama as the capital of Southern football, I think based on history, that's an okay thing to do. I sort of thought, well, who else should start it than people here? So that's fine. I went to West Virginia, Penn State, week 1. We hit West Virginia. That was another miss. I'm not always right.
I heard that one too. Yeah.
I might be stupid and I might be wrong, but I'm always going to tell you what I think. So we were all over West Virginia. So I think we got a little West Virginia vibes there. Now they're 3-4. So I don't know if people are still watching or not. Maybe a little Iowa State. We certainly, I think, have some Michigan, some Penn State, right? I mean, for Penn State, to be having this kind of year. I went to Penn State Media Day, and we've done it. I think we're pretty good with Pitt. I went to a Pitt practice. We're going to the Pitt-Syracuse game on Thursday night. Like, I think that's been a pretty good audience for us. So, again, not surprisingly, some of the audiences, we interviewed Mike Kadick, the Indiana center at Big Ten Media Days, and he basically said that everybody thinks he's John Candy. And we were like, God, we love this guy. And now he's playing it like an all Big Ten level for an undefeated team that's sweeping the nation. So, like, I think we maybe got some Indiana vibes off that.
Nice.
But, like, we understand that. I mean, like, we talked a lot of Nebraska last week, and I'm certainly like, I had Matt Rhule on the show for like 3 minutes at Big Ten Media Days, but I asked Matt Rhule about playing in the snow, right? Like, I love the Matt Rhule hire. I love that Dylan Raiola is at Nebraska instead of at Georgia, right? I like a lot of things happening in Nebraska, but we just got to get the word out, which is why I'm here. Thanks for helping me do it.
Yeah. Josh, how happy was Matt Rhule that he asked him about weather, do you think? That dude loves talking weather.
Loves
talking weather.
He had actually good snow stories about playing in some snow in Penn State.
I bet he did.
And in high school. Yeah.
I bet he did.
Hey, speaking of 72 hours about the.
Well, Josh is breaking up a little bit here.
Okay.
I wonder if it was me. A little bit here. Nope, it was Josh. It's definitely Josh. Let me ask you this. Speaking of Nebraska, I'll ask you this question. Speaking of Nebraska specifically, I was listening to your Saturday night pod.
Yeah.
After the games were over and you were pretty effusive in saying Indiana won that game. It wasn't that Nebraska lost that game. Why did you it's always interesting to hear an outsider's perspective. Why did you feel that way so strongly coming out of that game?
And I know Curtis Work got hurt, but I think in the end, it's sort of like, I think you understand of like, okay, Curtis Work, the Indiana quarterback that we did our All-North KOTN midseason team, he was our second team quarterback. He's been incredibly efficient. He's made that offense go. And I do think I chalk up some of this as part of the bumps, right? Like, I love playing a true freshman quarterback. But I think maybe you just have to accept this. I think Michigan State's in a little bit of a different spot because Aiden Childs is a second-year guy, but he didn't play a ton at Oregon State last year, and he had a lot of bumps in the first half of the season. But like, what are you aiming for? So I thought that in the end was and I talked about it on the show. I can understand. Indiana worked the portal in an incredibly successful way. They're basically two teams, right? I mean, it's like in World War II, the Eagles and the Steelers merged for a season and they were the Steagles. It's like JMU and Indiana merged. And it's like, hey, they're two teams. And guess what? When you merge two teams, you're pretty good. Like, that's what Indiana did. But Indiana was in a more desperate spot, right? Like, they had to get something going, and they're not a blue blood. So you go to the portal. I do think Nebraska is almost so good. It's not that you don't go to the portal at all. We understand they have. But I do think Nebraska is still a kind of program where you should want to and can build more organically. You want to do a little more in-house. And I do think that can lead to Indiana having a quicker transition. And if you're Nebraska saying, why is Curt Cignetti doing that in year one? And we're in year two of Matt Rhule, and here we are getting our butts kicked by Indiana. But I understand what Nebraska's doing. So I do just think, like, it's a veteran offensive line. It is a quarterback that is just like on point with everything. And I'm not going to you don't get a mulligan, but I'm not giving up on Nebraska because of it. And I understand the mistakes that are going to be made along the way, but I think do Nebraska fans feel like it's in pursuit of something? Like, if you're making mistakes, but you can see why, that's very different to me than like, what are we doing? And it feels like, to me, at least, Nebraska knows what might be down there in a year or two.
Yeah, I think, Doug, I think Saturday was like the first time this year, and dare I say in the Matt Rhule era, where people were like, is this going in the direction I was hoping it was going in?
Mm-hmm.
And that, I'll be honest. So I host a daily radio show in Omaha. I didn't expect us to have that discussion on our radio show this year. And so we've done that now a couple of times the last few days, and Jack and I have discussed it in the pod. I think that's what maybe has caught people off guard. Not that progress isn't linear, but that for the first time, people are like, ooh, is this the way to win in college football in 2024?
Yeah. It's a tough question in a world where So many teams are going for the instantaneous thing, right? So
Sure.
I think there's a lot from the Michigan model, right, that Nebraska can learn from, which is keep a lot of your guys, give them NIL, keep your good players around, and then strategically supplement at positions of need. That I think is the model. But I do think the idea of, I still think there's some programs like Ohio State's on a 1-year transfer, right? But Ohio for at quarterback with Will Howard, because the last guy didn't work out. But he's playing pretty well at Syracuse now. But like that, I still don't think that should be the plan for Ohio State. I think their plan should be to recruit and develop high school quarterbacks, right? And keep them. And I think that's a good idea for Nebraska. And I think Dylan Raiola can be a blueprint for that. But the hard thing is, you like Washington, Indiana went through some lumps with Michael Penix, and he had an injury, and he's learning on the way. And then you get to Washington, he's kind of like a finished product. Bo Nix was not very good at Auburn, but then he gets to Oregon, and you have something to work with, and all of a sudden you have 2 great years, and you get the payoff without the bumps. But that still doesn't mean to me that should be your plan necessarily. So I am still going to buy the idea that Aiden Childs at Michigan State, and you can see, I think, what Drew Aller and Penn State are doing. I think there's some of that in there. Dylan Raiola at Nebraska. I still think for programs like that trying to develop a guy and then have him be a 3 or even 4-year starter for your program, if you can work the NIL the right way, I still think there's something to that. You just might take one on the chin like you did on Saturday while you're getting there.
You think Signetti's still at Indiana 2 years from now in October?
Which SEC team you haven't stealing?
I don't know.
You want to start?
I don't know. We can think
this right now?
I'm just telling you it'll start with Florida. I don't know where it'll end,
God.
but
so I said on the show the other night. So Mel Tucker in year 2 at Michigan State, but the first year was a COVID year, so it kind of didn't count. So it was like his first year. Started 8-0. I think they start contract discussions. They were actually 9-2 by the time they got the deal done. 10 years, $95 million. Michigan State preemptively, before LSU or whoever else could come steal Mel Tucker, said, we think we have a guy, we're going to keep the guy. Now, he should have stayed off the phone. If he stays off the phone, who knows where we are? So tell Kurt Signetti to stay off the phone. But those are the conversations I think Indiana should be having right now. Don't let somebody do that. Don't let some fake, fraudulent, second-rate SEC team that's desperate come in here and throw money at him. You found him. You gave him the opportunity. And in this system, in a 12-team playoff like this, where you don't have to beat Ohio State and Penn State and Oregon to get where you want to go, where you have a real opportunity, why can't you keep him? So I'd get that. I'd get the 10-year. I mean, he's in his mid-50s. I'd get the 10-year, $100 million contract ready. And if they stepped up in NIL and that's the big conversation point, then step up here. You have rich people there. Mark Cuban went to Indiana. Get some of that Shark Tank money and keep Kurt Signetti. But why? Because part of that is desperation, and the whole coaching salaries are nuts, right? Why are they nuts? Because the SEC is desperate and drives up the prices, and then the North has to keep up. It's a crappy way of doing business. They're all overpaid, but to some degree, it's the world we live in. And frankly, a very successful college football head coach is worth it because he's so important to what they do, right? But also, I think there's been this idea of the SEC, that's the big leagues, right? Brett Bielema from Wisconsin to Arkansas. That's a step up. Why should the SEC be viewed as a step up? He's not getting hired at Georgia. I don't think they're firing Kalen DeBoer in 1 year at Bama. Tell me the SEC job that's better than where Indiana is right now. Why would he leave? Where are you going to go? So pay him and keep him, because your question is a very reasonable question. But if Indiana can't keep Kurt Signetti, then what are we doing? What are we doing?
Doug, I know that the debate around Indiana and their success, it swept through the state of Nebraska over the last week. I know it's been going on all around the country too. Is there anything you think they can do in the regular season that will get people to truly believe, barring is it just beating Ohio State? I wonder if they are really on the doorstep of the playoff in December, is there going to be a groundswell of people saying, finally, I buy in, or is it going to take just something pretty outlandish?
I think stomping Nebraska helped. I mean, I felt like there was a little bit of a shift because even Kurt Cignetti had been saying they didn't play the toughest schedule in the world. And again, I do think, and you guys can tell, I mean, like you would have a handle on this. I do think it is our tendency in the North to, after a game like that, dismiss the victor by saying, well, the loser stunk anyway. And in the South, when they have games like that, they prop up the loser by saying, wow, the winner is awesome. Well, I mean, sure, Bama lost to Vandy, but have you seen Vandy? That's how they do it down there. So why do we have to live in a world where the reaction to Indiana, Nebraska is more about Nebraska not being as good as you think rather than Indiana is better than anybody thought? Because that's where I am. I am not like set the program on fire for Nebraska. I'm like, this is confirmation of what we thought. So they have a Michigan game in a couple weeks that, you know, if Michigan has a pulse, which it doesn't look like Michigan has a pulse right now, because you thought, okay, maybe quarterback number 3 will be the answer, and it clearly wasn't. That's still enough of like I think there's a blue bloodness there that there'd be a little bit to it. But then they go off a bye week. They go to Columbus for Ohio State, which is the week before the Ohio State-Michigan game. So there's an opportunity there. But also, even if they lose that, like 11-1 Indiana is definitely in the playoff.
Yeah.
And there were national people a couple weeks ago saying I'd take 9-3 Ole Miss in the playoff ahead of 11-1 Indiana. And now I've seen like that person like tweeting like no, and it's like yeah, because you were a freaking moron when you said it the first time. So I like, but that's a high standard, right? If you don't like, what do you have to do to legitimize yourself? You have to win at Ohio State. That's a lot to ask. But go compete. Don't get blown off the field. But even if you do, like 11 wins is 11 wins. And I think like if I had to predict it right now, Washington, Michigan State, Michigan, like I think I'd predict 11-1 for Indiana.
Yeah.
Wow. You just made me realize that when playoff selection time comes, it is going to exacerbate everything that you talk about so much. Like, what do you think is going to be the most frequent controversy as we go into this new era of the playoff? Is it just going to be like SEC versus the world, or is it going to be how we treat losers in conference championship games versus non-participants in or is it going to be maybe a second G5 unbeaten team like versus a 4-loss SEC team or something like that? What do you anticipate with that whole selection process? We're all going into blind a little.
I really think it's playing out like right now. It's like how teams like Tennessee, which again, Tennessee, I think was 191-13 were the scores of its first 3 games when everybody thought it was the greatest offense ever. And their last 4 games are a 10-point win over Oklahoma that benched its starting quarterback, a loss to Arkansas, an overtime win over a Florida team that is trying to fire its head coach and it can't because the stupid SEC teams keep not beating them. And then a 7-point win over Alabama where Jalen Milroe and Nico Iamaleava were just airmailing passes all day. So that's Tennessee, and they're ranked ahead of Iowa State, BYU, and Indiana. Why? Why is LSU that lost to USC ranked ahead of those undefeated Northern teams? Like, why? So, like, we're seeing it play out a little bit right now because I think, like, I can't accept the answer. BYU has wins over 2 top 25 teams.
Yeah.
BYU beat SMU and Kansas State. And
killed Kansas State. Yep.
People think SMU might win the ACC. And it's like, what are we doing? Why are they not ranked ahead of LSU? There's no answer to it. So usually like the polls are, I used to be an AP poll voter. AP poll voters are morons. And they're also forced to vote at 2:00 in the morning after they cover their game because for some reason the AP poll has to come out on noon on Sunday. Why is that? Why can't the AP poll come out at 5:00 on Monday and give people a little time to evaluate things? I don't think the committee follows the polls. I actually think the polls adjust themselves after the committee. So I'm very curious to see all those things I just talked about. What's the committee going to do in 2 weeks when they evaluate those? I have more trust in the committee than I do in the polls by a lot. I trust the committee more than I could trust the computers. So, but I think that's the main thing because Greg Sankey is out there, hitting his coffee cup against the bars saying the SEC better get 5 teams in. And I'm telling you, brother, where are we going after Texas and Georgia right now? Because I don't see it.
Doug, I'm endlessly fascinated with Ohio State. In terms of the relationship with Ryan Day, I for the record, like my first Nebraska season that I can remember is the very end is 96, and then I remember 97. So I come to college football only knowing Tom Osborne is the greatest coach, ever, and winning national championships. So I wasn't around like Jack was during the heyday of debating whether to fire Tom Osborne or not. But I certainly see a lot of similarities, right, in that he wins a ton of games, but there is this one team in particular that he always loses to. Now this year he added he added the Oregon loss. But what I wonder, when you view him and the fan base and how they view him, like what is and isn't fair, do you think, about how the fan base views Ryan Day, and what is and isn't at stake for him this year in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly critiques and criticism are warranted. It frustrates me when, like, every time you think somebody didn't quite live up to what they should do, like, you go right to firing, right? And it's like, okay, for real? Like, Doug had a terrible Monday show, he should be fired. It's like, sometimes you just, don't do your thing. The hard thing about this is, and I think sometimes people want to have it both ways, you can't lose to Michigan 3 times in a row, and you can't lose to Michigan 4 times in a row. If they do it again this year, it's like, what does that mean? Well, it's just like, does that mean he should be fired if they lose to Michigan 4 times in a row? I felt like I did a lot of interviews in the preseason about, like, what if they don't? And I always said, how come nobody asked me what if they do? Right? Like, why? And everyone immediately, like Ohio State gets these transfers. They keep a lot of guys around. And it's like, is that pressure? It's like, is it pressure because you have good players? I don't know. I'd rather have good players than bad players. So I just think it's a lot of our inclinations in sports talk to take, like, a talented team with high expectations and automatically want to make it a bad thing. And the Ohio State fan base is absolutely part of that. By the way, Ohio State has not won nearly as many national championships as people think they've won, and they didn't win any between 1968 and 2002. So there's, like, it's not like you have a birthright to a national championship at Ohio State. And then the other complicating factor is, and this is part of the Northern thing, I've spent a lot of time the last 3 years trying to tell Ohio State fans, Michigan's good. Michigan's good. And people want to think that Michigan stinks. They want to think Penn State stinks. They want to think Oregon stinks. I'm like, what are you doing? Why do you do this? Why do you act like everybody else stinks? And the Columbus media does it. I picked Oregon to beat Ohio State. I literally could not find another person in the state of Ohio that picked Oregon in that game. In a 3-point spread on the road against the number 3 team in the country, it was like sweep. Everybody agrees Ohio State's going to win. It's like, really? You all agree? Nobody thinks it? Oregon's good. And then the other thing is, all the Ohio State fans think Michigan's a bunch of dirty cheaters for the Connor Stallions thing. So it's like, does that absolve Ryan Day? Or are they cheaters and Ryan Day is still in trouble for losing to the team that was cheating? Like, they kind of want all the worst of both worlds sometimes.
Yeah.
So I don't think he's fired if they don't do something this year. There comes a point. No Ohio State coach will ever go 2-10-1 against Michigan again, like John Cooper did. Not in this world. And I always say, it's like, not even that, like, he would be fired necessarily. It's like, you can't live. Like, he couldn't live. He'd leave, I think. Right? Like, if you've lost 5 straight to Michigan, your life is miserable. Yeah. You can't go to the grocery store. Your kids are getting yelled at recess. Like, it's not worth it. Go be an offensive coordinator in the NFL. So that's how I think about that. I thought it was a very reasonable loss at Oregon. I think Oregon's very good. They were right there. I didn't think they played a terrible game. I thought Ohio State, Oregon was a higher level game than Georgia, Texas, or especially Alabama, Tennessee, or even Alabama, Georgia, where that game was each team sucking for a half. That was not the case over Oregon, Ohio State. So, like, with Michigan down like they are, does Ohio State, like, have to beat Michigan? They're at home against a Michigan team that might have 5 wins coming into that game. Yeah. I mean, like, yeah, I think you've got, like, oh, yes, you've got to win that game. Should he be fired on his way to the locker room if they don't win that game? No, but they're more talented. They certainly should go win that game. But I don't think it's like, even some of their players said it. Denzel Burke, their corner, was like the leader of the natty or bust thing in the offseason. He said natty or bust. And then he got beat for 2 huge plays against Oregon. It's like, I don't know if I would have said that, man. And like, I'm the media. We love when guys say interesting things, but it's like, why do we have to operate? Because it's not bust. Because at a place like Ohio State, say they don't win the national title this year, like what's going to happen next year? They're going to try to win the national title. And they're going to have Jeremiah Smith. They're going to have 5-star Julian Sayin at quarterback. They're still going to have Caleb Downs. Like, it's not bust. That's the thing. It's not bust. It's not do or die. It's do or maybe do next year or maybe do next year. There's no die. So, but yes, of course, like they are very talented. I think they are as talented as any team in the country. I think they're probably the most talented team because I think Georgia actually doesn't have this. It doesn't have nearly the playmakers on offense that Ohio State has. So if they don't win the national championship, like what do you do with that? I don't know, but I don't think you immediately fire the guy.
So Ohio State, angry at coming off a loss
yes.
where they had the 12 men on the field thing used against them, and now the rules change. Got an off week to think about it. Most talented team in the country. So it sounds like they'll probably come out flat against Nebraska on Saturday is what I'm hearing you say.
There is a huge thing that I think like Nebraska fans definitely need to know, and I think they do know it. This is actually like the biggest thing that's happening at Ohio State right now is their starting left tackle, Josh Simmons, got hurt in the Oregon game and is out for the year. And he had probably been their best offensive lineman, and they are thin at offensive line. One of the big talking points is that their offensive line coach doesn't recruit well enough, and they've missed, especially on tackle. They've missed in the past couple cycles. They haven't brought in a big dude. So we didn't even know for sure who would be the next guy up at left tackle. And so it's going to be the guy who took over in that Oregon game. His name's Zen Michalski. He was like a lower rated guy that they flipped from Kentucky, or maybe it was Louisville. It was Louisville or Kentucky late in a cycle a couple years ago. The kind of guy that you probably think there's a good chance he'll never really play much at Ohio State. And he's the starting left tackle for the rest of the year, unless he flames out and they have to do something else. But it's also not exactly apparent what they would do. So like that's a big thing right now. And also their other offensive line spot that was iffy was right guard, where they've been playing two guys and neither of those guys played well against Oregon. And you could see it show up. There were some missed blocks. There were some false start penalties at the right guard spot. So they have two iffy offensive line spots right now. And I think that's going to show up. So that matters. And it is really interesting how Ohio State will adapt to that. And they also, and I will say, like, this has been a talking point, I think, from Ohio State, some Ohio State fans. And I'll be curious what Nebraska thinks of this. I've been to one game at Nebraska, I think. It was the game in 2011 when like Joe Boserman for Ohio State was throwing passes into the stands.
I was wondering if that was it.
And I was
wondering if that was it.
I was like, I love this town. I love this stadium. Dear God, what is this game? At Ohio State, the crowd can get disappointed very quickly.
Sounds like Lincoln.
Yep.
So sometimes people are like, the home field advantage. I'm like, you have a home field advantage at Ohio Stadium until you miss your first third down. And then people are like, I'm out. It's like, okay, I think they'd rather be on the road right now.
That's hilarious.
So it is not necessarily a great home field advantage. They did have a bye week to like let it sit. I don't know if that's good or bad for the fans, but I'm very curious how the crowd turns out. Because I can remember in 2008, after Ohio State had lost in the national championship games in 06 and 07, they went out to USC and they lost 35-3. And they changed quarterbacks. And the next game was actually Terrell Pryor's first start at Ohio State, and nobody came. People were like, I'm done. They lost to USC. I'm out. It was the emptiest I've ever seen Ohio Stadium.
Wow.
I don't think this is going to be that, but I am very curious. This is not necessarily a crowd that's going to be like, go get them, boys. Bounce back. It's going to be more like, you better not lose again. Natty or bust. So like it's just like high standards are wonderful. Passionate fans are wonderful. It can put an edge in the stadium, though, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Is the defense that the metrics are very, very good? Is it passing your eye test of what you expected from the defense this year? Because there was like all-time discussions before the year, right?
For sure.
Yeah,
I thought the secondary would be really good, and then you saw them get burned, have a couple penalties. I thought they had 3 NFL corners as their starters with Denzel Burke, Davison Igbinosun, and Jordan Hancock in the slot. I don't think any of them have necessarily played up to the level that I thought they would at that point. And then the entire discussion, well, part of the discussion early on was like they moved this really talented player named Sonny Styles, who's a third-year guy, from safety to linebacker. And everybody was like, that's a good move. He's more of a linebacker. But it took him a while to kind of figure it out, which is normal, except people were not being super patient with that. So there were a lot of questions about him. He actually played much better against Iowa and Oregon, I think. But the real discussion at this point is the defensive line for Ohio State. And they have a bunch of highly rated guys who could be in the NFL right now, and they don't get to the quarterback. So they get pressures. They never get sacks. They never get home. They don't make splash plays. And there's a lot of discussion in the Ohio State fan base. Larry Johnson is our longtime defensive line coach. He's probably like a Hall of Fame assistant coach in college football, long career at Penn State, father of Larry Johnson, the former Chiefs running back. Like, great defensive line coach, but kind of set in his ways, understandably. And Jim Knowles is the defensive coordinator who they brought in from Oklahoma State when they needed to fix their defense after 2020. And Jim Knowles wants to play kind of like more of a three-man front with a stand-up end who moves around as the fourth guy. And Larry Johnson wants to play a four-man front no matter what. And there's been, I think, like a push and pull between those two. And a lot of people think like they don't mesh in philosophy. And the result is like they don't get any pressure on the quarterback. Now, it also might be that they don't have a Bosa or Chase Young on this team, which they did for like 8 years in a row. And then you think, well, the next guy will be Chase Young, will be Nick Bosa or Joey Bosa. And it's like, well, they're not. So they have two fourth-year senior defensive ends who were both five-star recruits, JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer. They've been good. They are not Bosa's or Chase Young. And so that, like, everyone's kind of been waiting their whole careers for them to get to that point. And here they are in year 4, and they're not that. And people are wondering why. So it's one of those ideas of they're probably their tackles are more dangerous than their ends at this point. It's like you get a freshman quarterback, you come in, but I don't know that Ohio State's going to get after him because they don't really get a lot of four-man pressure. And because of this possible disconnect on the defensive staff, they don't do a lot of blitzing. So they don't get home. They really don't.
Interesting.
All right. Feeling better already.
I mean, but again, like, right. I mean, for real, when Dylan Raiola committed to Ohio State, the show I was doing then, we did a 14-hour podcast on Dylan Raiola, future Buckeye. It was like Ryan Day beats Lincoln Riley for Dylan Raiola. This is the proof. Who is the real quarterback whisperer? Dylan Raiola, the new Ohio State. Oh, he's going to Georgia. And it's like, oh my God, he moved to Georgia to go to high school? And what are we doing? And then I was like, oh, thank God he's going to Nebraska. That's much better. So, like, you know, like this will be super, like Dylan Raiola, like Ohio State fans are super familiar with Dylan Raiola, and they were all on board. That was a very big deal. And so it's like, oh, Ohio State's playing a transfer quarterback from Kansas State. That's nothing against Will Howard, but that is not the plan at all. And what are you going to do a quarterback? We're going to get the Kansas State guy. You're going to get who? The Kansas State guy that's probably losing his job? That's the plan? Yeah, it's good. And he's played pretty well, actually. But I'm very curious, like how I think Ohio State fans are very curious to watch what Dylan Raiola is going to do in that stadium.
I'm sure. My last question for you, and I know Josh is going to ask about the playoff, and I am too. I'm just curious, doing content about the regular season as you have every single day, does this new iteration of the playoff make it more fun and interesting to talk about the regular season than one of the previous iterations, or not? Because obviously the conversation was it's going to devalue the regular season when you add this. But on the other hand, obviously you've got all of these conversation of, you know, who gets in, what's the situation with the group of 5 team, those sorts of things. What do you think? Do you like it or not so far?
100% love it. I don't think there's a downside. And I said going in, there was a time when I was a 4-team guy, but I definitely evolved into a 12-team guy. And I've said that if the thing that you're missing is the devastating loss, right? If it like that Georgia lost to Alabama and it didn't ruin their season, that Ohio State lost to Oregon and it didn't ruin their season. And it's like you long for, it's like, oh, man, you know what I loved? I loved when a really talented college football team had its season ruined in October. That was the best. That was my favorite thing about college football, that you work all off season, you spend all this NIL money, and by October 15th, you're dead. Like, really? That's what you like the most? So I think like all the conversations that we're having about Iowa State and BYU and Indiana, and like Colorado and Cincinnati play on Saturday night. That's 5-2 against 5-2. They each have only one loss in the Big 12. The winner of that game remains in the thick of the Big 12 race. Can you imagine in a previous generation of college football being psyched for a 5-2 game between Colorado and Cincinnati? We cannot wait for that game.
I agree.
So it's provided so much more opportunity. And I really don't think Ohio State, Oregon lost anything. I don't think Texas, Georgia lost anything just because Texas is not out of the playoff because they lost. Because I don't think people think about, I'll tell you, from an Ohio State fan perspective, nobody was like, no big deal. Did not hear a single Ohio State fan say,
all good.
We'll be a 7 seed instead of a 2 seed. Who cares? It doesn't matter. They went crazy. So I honestly don't think we've lost anything. It was the only major North American sport where we required perfection. And so but it didn't take away the impact or the excitement around the games. And then the much bigger opportunity, I think, is wonderful. So I think it's been a huge success. And I think people are still underestimating how I think this 12-team playoff is going to take over the calendar for 5 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is going to be gigantic, especially in a world where everything beyond the playoff games was devalued in the opt-out era.
Yeah.
Right? You didn't even get excited about New Year's 6 games because it's like, well, it's 100%. Not really them.
Yep.
We don't have it's going to set the football world on fire. And I think it'll, like the NFL, I get it. The end of the regular season is important. This is going to be the number one thing happening in American sport.
Yeah. Josh and I talk about that first weekend right before Christmas with the home games. What is it? Friday and then 3 on Saturday that they're going to do. Yeah. Like it's a dream, right? It's March Madness with football.
It is.
Basically.
It is.
It's great.
With America's favorite sport. Yeah.
So
fired
Doug,
up for it.
We'll get you out of here on this one. You love telling the South to cram it. What does the college football playoff ultimate crammage look like for you and the South? And like, are you someone who is like, I want Georgia to actually make it to the title game and then lose because that'd be funnier? Or are you hoping for like maximum carnage by the time the second weekend is done?
Oh, so we have like a rooting list, right? For our Southern football rooting list for KOTN fans. Number 1 is any result, anything that happens that pushes back or destroys the myth of Southern superiority, right? That's the number 1 thing we root for. Number 2 is anything that busts the national media narrative around the SEC and Southern college football. So that's the second thing. Like that's at the media, right? Number 3 is root against Georgia. Number 4 is root against Bama. Number 5 is root for chaos. So that's how we think about Southern football. So like, Georgia can lose the rest of their games. Fine. Put Vandy in the playoff. Great. Let Kurt Signetti boat race Vandy. I don't need to see Kirby Smart in December, but I would very much look forward to as many North-South matchups in the first round as possible. Please. Right. I would very much love though, like a national title game that's all North again, just like we had last year with Michigan and Washington, where like the South doesn't even get to participate. It's like, hey, it's on our terms. Like, good luck. Hey, the national title game's Iowa State, Indiana. How do you like that, Kirby? Like, I'm here for it. Right. So like that, but and also like if the South and the South and North play and the South wins all the playoff games, like we'll have to acknowledge that. Like we're not going to close our eyes to reality. But at the moment, I think the North is right there. And like I had a rant the other night, there's nothing to be scared of. I covered Ohio State at a time where I wasn't here in 2002 when Ohio State beat Miami, but I was here in 2006 and 2007 when they lost to Florida and LSU. And after that, I think the North was scared of the South. Mm-hmm. Like in that era for the next 12, 15 years before Ohio State won it in 14, I think the North was scared. They assumed they couldn't compete. I don't think anybody should think that way right now. I don't think there's anything happening at Texas or Georgia or Alabama or LSU or Clemson or Miami that the North can't compete with. So bring it on. So give me as much North-South as possible in a North national title game, and I'll be happy.
And get me a South team coming to a snow game in the North.
Go.
I mean,
let's go.
I don't care. One of those SAC teams that gets a low LSU or somebody sneaks in, right, as a 10 seed.
Yep.
This is the scenario. Give me some snow. 100. I don't care if it's in Oregon or Penn State, wherever it needs to be. It's got to happen.
I was so excited. I went to the Wisconsin-Alabama game in week 3 because I was like, this is what we're all about.
Yeah.
And it was like 85. Yeah. And I was like,
Northern football.
what are we doing?
Yeah. Well, the North in September is not all that unique. Yes.
The good thing I liked about that was that if people don't know this, you guys might, that Camp Randall Stadium is named that because it is built on the site of Camp Randall, which was a Union military training site during the Civil War. So I was watching all these Alabama fans take their pictures in front of all the Union memorials at Camp Randall. And I was like, okay, scoreboard on that one.
Doug,
perfect thing to end it on, Josh.
Yes,
perfect thing to end it on, man.
Doug, this was awesome. Tell the folks. We said it at the start. I could not say it again, or I will say it again. It's one of our favorite podcasts of college football. It's certainly our favorite college football podcast. Where can people subscribe?
Yeah, so you can find us on Instagram, find us on Twitter at KOTN CFB. You can subscribe on YouTube. That's the best way to find us. Just Google Kings of the North, KOTN. You'll find us on YouTube. We also are on every podcast platform as well. But like we think about it like as a TV show, we have graphics and things. We'll show clips sometimes that it is, I think, a better experience on video. But we'll take you however we can get you. We do it live on YouTube Monday through Thursday at noon Eastern. Okay. For about 90 minutes. Sometimes we leak over. So it's 4 days a week live then. And then we have a live show Saturday night, 11 p.m. Yes. That's usually like the 7:30 Eastern games have just ended or are just ending. And then we have a betting show that we put out on Friday mornings.
Awesome. Very cool. Very good. And among those clips I've seen there is the Kirby Smart shoving the player clip.
Did you see? Oh, excuse me.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were here. Here, just get out of my way. Oh, sorry. I didn't even mean it. I'm just filled. I'm just a man in control of a gazillion-dollar budget and the lives of 125 young people. And I am filled with white-hot rage, and I cannot control myself.
Doug Lesmerises, Kings of the North with Bill Landis, man. As he mentioned, 5 times live a week, plus the Friday betting show. Doug, a true pleasure. Thank you so much for talking some football with us tonight.
100%. Had a great time. Really appreciate you guys having me on.
Awesome. Right. Jack and I will be back tomorrow night, Wednesday night into club. For subscribers, go to patreon.com/I-80 club if you would like to join us, and then we'll be back on Saturday morning as well. He's Jack. I'm Josh. He is Doug. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you later.